Alrighty, so I am including this quick video and I'm going to go over some information in this paper that relates to the butterfly adaptation question that is on your worksheet. And the reason that I am choosing to look at a scientific paper is because I know that it has been peer reviewed and is more robust than other types of information we might find on the internet. So this is an open access paper, but if you find something that you are having trouble getting access to, it's very likely that you'll be able to get access to it through the university's library. And this paper comes from the European Journal of Entomology, and the title is Variation in the Morphology of the Wings of the Endangered Grass-Feeding Butterfly, Cononympha oedipus. And just as an aside, the Latin names of any organism should be written as this is written in italics. The first letter of the genus, Cononympha, is capitalized, and the species epithet is not capitalized but still in italics. And then when you see something like this in parentheses of a paper, Lepidoptera, Nymphalidae, this is pointing out that this species is in the order Lepidoptera, which is butterflies and moths, and in the family Nymphalidae. And then, to read the whole thing again, variation in the morphology of the wings of the endangered grass-feeding butterfly Cononympha oedipus in response to contrasting habitats. So I found this paper on Google Scholar and pulled it up and looked at the abstract to see if it had the information that I wanted. And the abstracts are actually pretty dense because it's as short as the authors can possibly make it, but conveys all the ideas almost that are in the paper, right? And in a short form. So I read through this. I certainly didn't get all of the information on the first read through. And I was also looking for something specific, which is that I wanted to look at the eye spots on hindwings, and they're talking about how there is some sexual dimorphism happening in this same species, and that means that sexual dimorphism means that there are different physical traits that we can observe. Typically, they means ones that we can observe just from looking at the insect. However, they can be internal, of course, and even aside from reproductive organs, there can be other internal differences between males and females of a species. And they're discussing that here because the eye spots on the wings, the wing patterning, is different between the males and females of the species, and also looks like there's some relation rather to air temperature on whether or not there are some differences in the wings as well. And that's what they talk about here with ecotype specific variation. Um, an ecotype is kind of like, as an example, if you have one species that lives on a mountain and its range can go all the way up maybe to the top of the mountain, and it's a tall mountain, and you have different temperatures up there, of course, and even maybe more wind exposure, more precipitation. Even though they're the same species, you might see several changes in that species from the top of the mountain to the bottom of the mountain. And so those are different ecotypes. And so basically that can happen typically over different areas, but I'm sure that there are exceptions to that. And I'm just going to read through the first little bit of this introduction because introductions are great. They're a little bit easier to read than abstracts, and it contains a lot of background information for the subject. And this is the part where the authors will cite a lot of other research that has been done in this area. And another type of paper, an entire paper that can be like an introduction, are called review papers. And they're really great for getting a very thorough background of a very specific subject. However, they're very long usually. So sometimes if you just need some quick information like you do for this question, you can find a paper like this, read through the introduction, and get the information that you're looking for. So this little bit reads, butterfly wing morphology commonly varies among species and populations and even between the two sexes. So what this means is that the morphology, the size and shape of the wings, of butterflies can vary among species. So what they mean there by saying among is in the same species, between species, as we'll talk about later. And they're also talking about populations. So kind of like an ecotype, you have a population in one area and then a population of the same species in another area, and that wing morphology can vary even though they're the same species. And then they are meaning here, even between the two sexes, they're probably meaning even if you have that same species in the same area, we're getting some differences between males and females as well, which is sexual dimorphism. Variation in wing morphology is thought to be the result of complex interactions between genetic, epigenetic, and environmental variability. I'm sure most of you know what genetic means. Epigenetic, a very simple definition of epigenetics would be genes that we have already or the organism has already that can be turned on and off by certain environmental conditions or potentially other reasons for being turned on and off, age, etc. And that's way more complicated, but this is a very new field, and I don't know a ton about it because it's not my field, but it's very exciting and interesting. In addition to flight, the most obvious function of wings, their morphological traits such as size, shape, color, and pattern, have a number of interacting functions, including thermoregulation, intra and inter-specific communication. Thermoregulation means regulating their temperature, so making sure they're not too hot or too cold, thermoregulation. Intra-specific means something that's happening in the same species between individuals in that species, in that group of those same species. Interspecific means interactions that are happening between two different species, so individuals of different species, or groups even. But basically, that's what it means. So when they're talking about communication, an example of intra-specific communication could be between a male and a female during mating season, where the male is trying to become attractive to the female to get them to mate with it. And interspecific communication, an example of that could be between, let's say, a butterfly species and a moth species that eat the same thing, and they're on a food source, and perhaps the moth is being aggressive and is more aggressive than the butterfly. That's an example of communication between two different species, interspecific communication. Specific functions of the wings are related to unique sets of wing characteristics or combinations of wing pattern elements. For example, wing size and shape are related to flight, pigmentation or degree of melanization to thermoregulation, specific ventral and dorsal position of bands and eye spots to intraspecific communication, predator avoidance and evasion. All right, so it's a very long sentence. We're going to break it down a little bit here because it's a very important sentence. So they're giving examples of what they're talking about here. Wing size and shape are obviously related to flight. So perhaps a butterfly that needs to migrate a lot farther in distance will have a larger wingspan to help them with that. Pigmentation or degree of melanization is related to thermal regulation, so the coloration of their wings, the pigmentation. The degree of melanization, so melanization means that the color is darker and that this is related to thermoregulation. And that makes sense, as we know, because darker colors or more highly saturated colors, if they're dark especially, will be able to absorb sunlight better. And as we all know, if you are wearing like black shirt or something on a very hot day in Riverside, you're going to be a lot hotter than if you wear a white shirt, right? So that's similar to what we're talking about here. Specific ventral and dorsal position of bands and eye spots. That means that the positioning of the patterns on a wing, whether they be like bands or eye spots, and whether or not they're specific to the ventral side of the wing or the dorsal side of the wing. So ventral is kind of on the outside. So if you have a dog, its belly is its ventral side and its back, its spine, is its dorsal side. So for butterflies, this means butterflies fold their wings behind their backs. So when they do that, they are exposing the ventral side of their wings and they are hiding the dorsal side of their wings. and that is related to intra-specific communication. So the other uh, individuals of that species can recognize those patternings that patterning, and also related to predator avoidance and evasion. And eye spots are related to predator avoidance and evasion because they can scare a predator, which means they're being able to evade the predator faster by tricking them for a minute, but with these eye spots, or predator avoidance, where we might have bands of colors that mimic their surroundings, so they're able to blend in and stay very still perhaps so that they can avoid being seen. And they go on to talk about this species and how males are more likely to disperse in the previous section up here, which I'm not going to read through. But then they talk about that females are a more sedentary sex, so they don't move as much, they don't disperse as much. And so, as such, they're exposing their ventral wing surfaces more than males. And that's because they're sitting around a lot more with their wings folded behind their backs. So, this is an example of the ventral surface here. So, this is like the butterfly's belly, we might say, and then its backside is the one on the other side. So whatever's on the opposite side of this wing is going to be folded and be inside and not exposed, so not being seen so much. So here the authors are talking about what they predict is happening, is going to happen with their research. And so based on a lot of information that they've done already in researching this topic in the previous literature. Therefore, we predicted that females have a larger number and larger eye spots on the underside of their wings. Larger and multiple submarginal eye spots on the ventral surface enable more efficient avoidance of attacks by predators. So if these females are sitting around and not in the position that we see here, right? This is not their wings folded back behind them, which is how they would sit if they were on a branch and being sedentary, which they're talking about here. So they'll have larger and more multiple, they're predicting they'll have larger and more multiple spots so that they can scare off predators more. So it is a wonderful adaptation that would make sense, and that's why they're predicting it. I didn't read through the entire paper, but it talks about it in the abstract if you're interested in finding out if that was really the case, because oftentimes scientists may find the opposite of their hypothesis. But they're making this hypothesis because of all the previous literature that is related to this subject and how it related to different species or maybe even very similarly related species. So they're making this prediction based on that. So that gives you a good idea of how butterflies can adapt, especially regarding their wing patternization.